The gravel crunched beneath the tires of Marcus's old Jeep as they wound their way up the mountain road. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her window rolled down, breathing in the crisp, pine-scented air that grew cooler with each passing mile. In the back, their friends, Jake and Emma, were engaged in their usual banter, their laughter punctuating the steady hum of the engine. "Are you sure this place is even open?" Emma asked, leaning forward between the front seats. "I couldn't find anything about it online except that one weird forum post." Marcus glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "That's what makes it perfect. No crowds, no reservation fees, just pure wilderness camping like it used to be. My uncle came here back in the 80s and said it was incredible." "Your uncle also believed in Bigfoot and claimed he was abducted by aliens," Jake pointed out with a grin. "Hey, don't knock Uncle Ray. He might have been eccentric, but he knew his camping spots." Sarah smiled, watching the dense forest blur past her window. Towering pines stretched toward the darkening sky, their branches interlocking overhead to form a natural tunnel. Shafts of late afternoon sunlight pierced through the canopy, creating dancing patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. It was beautiful, she had to admit, even if there was something vaguely unsettling about how the trees seemed to press in on the narrow road. "How much further?" she asked. Marcus checked the odometer. "Should be about 3 more miles. Uncle Ray said to look for a wooden sign that says Blackwood Campground and turn right onto a dirt road." They drove in companionable silence for a few minutes, the mood in the car shifting slightly as the forest grew darker around them. The sun was sinking lower, and up here in the mountains, darkness came quickly. Sarah found herself watching the tree line, noting how deep and impenetrable it looked. You could walk 10 feet into those woods and be completely invisible from the road. "There," Emma pointed ahead. "Is that it?" A weathered wooden sign emerged from the undergrowth on the right side of the road. The words Blackwood Campground were barely visible, carved into wood that had been darkened by decades of rain and neglect. An arrow pointed down a narrow dirt track that disappeared into the forest. Marcus turned onto the road, and immediately the ride became rougher. The Jeep bounced over ruts and rocks, branches scraping against the sides with sounds that made Emma wince. The forest here was different than it had been on the main road. Thicker, older. The trees were massive, their trunks wider than the Jeep itself, their bark scarred and deeply furrowed with age. "This place hasn't been maintained in a while," Jake observed, gripping the handle above his door as they hit a particularly deep pothole. "That's what makes it authentic," Marcus insisted, though even he sounded less confident now. They drove for another 10 minutes, the road winding deeper into the woods. Just when Sarah was about to suggest they turn back and find somewhere else to camp, the trees opened up into a clearing. Blackwood Campground spread before them in the fading light. It was larger than Sarah had expected, a roughly circular clearing of about 2 acres, ringed completely by the dense forest. Several concrete fire pits marked designated camping spots, their surfaces cracked and stained with years of use. A dilapidated wooden structure that might have once been a bathroom facility stood at the far end of the clearing, its roof partially collapsed, one wall covered in creeping vines. In the center of the campground stood something unexpected. A large wooden post, about 8 feet tall, with what looked like deep gouges carved into its surface. Around its base, the grass grew sparse and brown, forming a perfect circle about 6 feet in diameter where nothing seemed to want to grow. "Well," Emma said slowly, "it's definitely ... rustic." Marcus parked near one of the fire pits and killed the engine. In the sudden silence, the sounds of the forest became immediately apparent. Birds called from the trees, their songs somehow mournful in the dimming light. Somewhere in the distance, a branch cracked. The wind whispered through the pines with a sound almost like voices. They climbed out of the Jeep, stretching after the long drive. Sarah walked toward the center of the clearing, drawn to the strange wooden post. As she got closer, she could see that the gouges weren't random. They formed patterns, almost like writing, but in no language she recognized. The wood itself was dark, almost black, and despite the decay evident everywhere else in the campground, this post looked solid and well preserved. "What do you think this is?" she called back to the others. Marcus had already started unloading camping gear, probably some old trail marker or something. "Come on, we need to set up camp before it gets dark." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the post was something more than that. She reached out to touch one of the carved grooves, and a chill ran through her fingers. The wood was ice cold, despite the warm evening air. "Sarah," Emma's voice made her jump, "help me with the tent." Sarah turned away from the post, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. They spent the next hour setting up their campsite. Marcus and Jake worked on one tent, while Sarah and Emma set up another nearby. They chose a spot near the edge of the clearing, close to the tree line, but not so close that they'd be in shadow when the sun rose. As Sarah hammered in tent stakes, she kept catching movement in her peripheral vision. Every time she looked up, there was nothing there, just the darkening forest and the lengthening shadows. The wind had picked up, making the branches sway and creating the illusion of figures moving between the trees. Getting spooked? Emma asked with a knowing smile. She'd been friends with Sarah long enough to recognize the signs. No, Sarah lied. Just ... It's very isolated out here, isn't it? That's the point. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, no distractions. Just us and nature. Emma hammered in the last stake and stood back to admire their work. Though I have to admit, this place has a weird vibe. By the time both tents were set up and their gear was organized, the sun had dipped below the tree line. The clearing was bathed in that strange twilight that comes just before true darkness, when colors fade and everything takes on a gray, uncertain quality. Marcus got a fire going in one of the concrete pits, and they gathered around it gratefully. The temperature had dropped significantly with the sunset, and the warmth of the flames was welcome. Jake broke out a cooler full of hot dogs and beer, and for a while they fell into the comfortable rhythm of old friends sharing a meal and swapping stories. So what's the story with this place? Emma asked, poking at the fire with a stick. Why is it so abandoned? It's got a great location, decent facilities apart from that condemned bathroom. You'd think someone would maintain it. Marcus shrugged. Uncle Ray said something about the rangers shutting it down in the 90s. Some kind of dispute with the forestry service, I think, but the land is still public, so technically we're allowed to camp here. Your uncle is a wealth of vague information, Jake said dryly. He also mentioned something about people not liking to stay here, Marcus added, his tone suggesting he was trying to sound mysterious. Said it had a reputation for being unlucky. Sarah glanced toward the wooden post in the center of the clearing. It was fully dark now, but the post seemed to catch what little light remained, standing out against the darkness like a pale finger pointing at the sky. What kind of unlucky? Emma asked, leaning forward with interest. She'd always loved ghost stories. He wouldn't say it, just that people who camped here sometimes left in the middle of the night. Marcus grinned around his beer. But Uncle Ray was also known for embellishing his stories, so who knows what actually happened. They talked and laughed for another hour as the fire burned down to glowing coals. The forest around them was alive with night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the endless whisper of wind through pine needles. Normal sounds, Sarah told herself. Just nature being nature. But there was another sound too, one that came and went so subtly that at first Sarah thought she was imagining it. It was like whispering just at the edge of hearing, not words exactly, but the rhythm and cadence of speech, coming from no particular direction. Sometimes it seemed to come from the forest, sometimes from across the clearing, sometimes from right behind her. She turned to ask if anyone else heard it, but stopped when she saw Emma yawning hugely. I'm beat, Emma announced. That drive took it out of me. Anyone else ready for bed? Jake checked his watch. It's only 10:30, we're on camping time now. 10:30 is like midnight. Emma stood and stretched. Come on, Sarah, let's leave the boys to their manly fire-tending duties. Sarah was tired too, and the idea of being zipped safely inside a tent suddenly seemed very appealing. She said goodnight to Marcus and Jake, grabbed her flashlight, and followed Emma to their tent. Inside, they changed into sleeping clothes and settled into their sleeping bags. Emma was asleep within minutes, her breathing deep and even, but Sarah lay awake, staring at the tent ceiling, listening to the sounds outside. The whispers were more pronounced now, or maybe she was just more aware of them in the quiet. They seemed to ebb and flow like waves, sometimes barely audible, sometimes almost loud enough to make out words. Sarah told herself it was just the wind, just her imagination, just the natural anxiety of sleeping in an unfamiliar place. Across the clearing, she could hear Marcus and Jake's voices as they talked by the fire. Their conversation was a comfort, a reminder that she wasn't alone out here. Eventually, their voices faded, and she heard the rustle of them entering their own tent. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to sleep. She must have dozed off, because when she opened her eyes again, it was to complete darkness and complete silence. The sudden absence of sound was what woke her. No wind, no rustling, no distant animal calls, nothing. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Sarah lay perfectly still, her heart beginning to pound. Next to her, Emma slept on, undisturbed. Through the thin fabric of the tent, Sarah could see nothing. No moonlight, no starlight, just absolute darkness. And then she heard footsteps. They were soft, barely audible, but definitely footsteps. They circled the tent slowly, deliberately. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It had to be Marcus or Jake, she told herself. Maybe one of them needed to use the woods and was just checking on them. but somehow she knew it wasn't one of her friends. The footsteps stopped directly outside the tent entrance. Sarah couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She waited for something to happen, for the zipper to move, for a voice to call out, for a light to shine through the fabric. But there was nothing, just the sense of something standing there, just on the other side of the thin nylon barrier. So close she could have reached out and touched it if she'd dared. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved away, continuing their circuit around the tent, around and around, in a slow, steady circle. Sarah lost count of how many times they circled. It could have been 3 times or 30. Time seemed to stretch and distort in the darkness. Finally, the footsteps moved away, heading toward the center of the clearing. Sarah waited until she couldn't hear them anymore, then waited longer still, her whole body tense. When nothing else happened, she finally let herself breathe. She told herself it had been an animal, a deer maybe, or a bear, investigating the campsite. But she knew the footsteps had been too measured, too deliberate. Whatever had been out there had been walking on 2 legs. Not for she lay awake until the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the tent fabric, and only then did she finally fall into an uneasy sleep. Part 2. The first day Sarah woke to the sound of Emma unzipping the tent. Bright morning sunlight flooded in, along with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. "Morning, sleepyhead," Emma said cheerfully. "Marcus made breakfast. Come on. It's gorgeous out here." Sarah emerged from the tent, squinting in the bright light. The campground looked completely different in the daylight. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and green, and birds sang enthusiastically from the surrounding trees. The oppressive atmosphere of the night before seemed like a distant dream. Marcus and Jake had set up a camping stove near the fire pit and were cooking breakfast. Marcus waved a spatula at her in greeting. "Sleep okay?" he asked. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. In the bright morning light, telling them about the footsteps seemed ridiculous. What would she say? That she'd heard something walking around the tent in the middle of the night. They'd just laugh and tell her it was a raccoon or her imagination. Like a log, she lied. "What's for breakfast?" They ate scrambled eggs and bacon, washing it down with strong camp coffee. The food and the sunlight helped dispel the lingering unease from the night before. They spent the morning exploring the campground and the surrounding area, finding a small stream about a quarter-mile into the forest where the water ran clear and cold over smooth rocks. "We should hike up to the ridge this afternoon," Jake suggested, pointing up the slope. "I bet there's an amazing view from up there." But as they walked back toward camp, Sarah found herself lagging behind, studying the forest around them. There was something off about it, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what. The trees were wrong somehow. Not the species or the arrangement, but something more subtle. It took her a while to realize what it was. There was no undergrowth. In a healthy forest, there should be layers. Tall trees, smaller trees, bushes, ferns, fallen logs, slowly decomposing and covered in moss. But here, beneath the towering pines, there was almost nothing, just bare ground covered in a carpet of brown needles. It reminded her of something she'd read once about how certain trees poisoned the soil around them to prevent competition. "You coming?" Emma called back. The others had reached the campsite and were waiting for her. Sarah hurried to catch up, filing away her observation. Probably just the particular soil conditions or elevation, she told herself. Nothing sinister about it. They spent the afternoon hiking, as Jake had suggested. The trail up the ridge was steep and overgrown, but the view from the top was worth the effort. They could see for miles in every direction. Endless green forest stretching to distant mountains, unmarred by any sign of human habitation. No roads, no buildings, no power lines. It was beautiful and terrifying in its vastness. "We're really in the middle of nowhere, aren't we?" Emma said, echoing Sarah's thoughts. "Best kind of nowhere," Marcus replied, but even he sounded a bit odd. They made it back to camp in the late afternoon and spent the rest of the day relaxing. Jake tried to fish in the stream with limited success. Marcus and Emma played cards. Sarah found herself drawn back to the wooden post in the center of the clearing. Up close, in better light, she could see more details. The carvings definitely weren't random. They formed distinct symbols, repeated in patterns around the post. Some looked almost like letters from an ancient alphabet. Others were more pictographic, what might have been a tree or a hand or a figure with outstretched arms. Near the base of the post, mostly hidden by the dead grass, was a metal plaque. Sarah knelt down and brushed away the dirt and debris. The plaque was old and tarnished, but she could just make out the engraved text, erected 1932, in memory of those lost. May they rest. No names, no explanation of who had been lost or how. Just that cryptic message. Sarah pulled out her phone to take a picture, then remembered there was no cell service. She'd have to try to remember the exact wording to look it up later. "Hey Sarah," Marcus called. "We're starting dinner. You hungry?" She stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. "Yeah, be right there." But as she walked back toward the fire pit, she glanced over her shoulder at the post. For just a moment, in the slanting evening light, the shadows around its base seemed to move. Dinner was hot dogs and beans. Simple but satisfying. As the sun began to set, they built up the fire again. This time, Jake had brought a guitar, and he strummed it idly as they talked and joked. The music was nice, Sarah thought. It filled the silence, pushed back against the darkness gathering at the edge of the firelight. "So," Emma said, her eyes glinting with mischief, "should we tell scary stories? It's practically a camping requirement." "I've got a good one," Jake said, setting down his guitar. "True story. Happened to my cousin's friend. They were camping up in Oregon, middle of nowhere, just like this. First night they heard something walking around their tent. Figured it was a bear, so they stayed quiet. Didn't want to provoke it. But then they heard it stop outside the tent entrance. And here's the weird part. They heard it breathing. Not animal breathing, but human breathing. Long, slow breaths. Like someone standing there just listening." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Jake's story was hitting a little too close to home. They waited it out. Jake continued, and eventually it went away. Next morning they found footprints in the dirt around their tent. Human footprints. Bare feet. But here's the kicker. The footprints didn't lead anywhere. They circled the tent 3 times, and then they just ... stopped. Like whoever it was just vanished. "That's creepy," Emma said, delighted. "What did they do?" "Packed up and left immediately. Drove straight home. My cousin's friend said he'd never go camping again. Probably just some local messing with them," Marcus said, but he looked uneasy. "Some guy who knew where campers usually set up and liked to freak people out." "Maybe," Jake said. "But those footprints, ... I saw the pictures. They really did just stop in the middle of the clearing. No tracks leading away, no sign anyone had jumped or run. Just ... nothing." Sarah wanted to tell them about what she'd heard last night, but couldn't bring herself to do it. It would just make her look scared or foolish, and besides, it had probably been her imagination. Or a dream. Yes, a dream. That made sense. They told more stories as the fire burned lower. Marcus contributed one about a haunted cabin in the woods. Emma told one about a hitchhiker who disappeared from a locked car. The stories blended together, each one feeding off the others, building an atmosphere of delicious dread. But Sarah noticed something as they talked. The whispers she'd heard the night before were back. They were faint, almost inaudible beneath the crackling of the fire and her friends' voices, but they were there, and they seemed to be getting louder, or closer, or both. She looked toward the tree line. The forest beyond the firelight was pitch black, impenetrable. Anything could be standing just beyond the reach of the flames, watching them, and they'd never know. "I think I'm ready for bed," she said abruptly, standing up. The others looked at her in surprise. "It's barely 9, Marcus said. "I know, but I'm exhausted. That hike really took it out of me." Sarah forced a smile. "You guys stay up, I'll be fine." Emma stood too. "I'll come with you. I could use some sleep myself." They said goodnight and headed to their tent. Once inside, Sarah felt marginally better. She changed quickly and burrowed into her sleeping bag. "You okay?" Emma asked quietly. "You seemed kind of off today." "I'm fine," Sarah said. "Just tired, and maybe a little creeped out by all those stories." "They're just stories," Emma said, but she didn't sound entirely convinced herself. "Though I have to admit, this place does have a weird vibe at night." They lay in silence for a while. Outside they could hear Marcus and Jake talking by the fire, their voices rising and falling in casual conversation. The sound was comforting, a reminder of normalcy. Sarah was almost asleep when Emma spoke again. "Do you hear that?" Sarah's eyes snapped open. "Hear what?" "That whispering sound, like voices, but I can't make out what they're saying, so it wasn't just her imagination." Sarah's heart began to pound. "I hear it too." They lay in the darkness, listening. The whispers seemed to surround the tent, coming from all directions at once. They rose and fell like waves, sometimes barely audible, sometimes almost loud enough to make out words. Almost, but not quite. "It's probably just the wind," Emma said, but her voice was uncertain. "Wind in the trees can sound like voices." "There's no wind tonight." Emma was quiet for a moment. "Maybe we should tell the guys." Before Sarah could respond, they heard Marcus and Jake saying goodnight and heading to their own tent. The fire must have burned down. Soon the whole campsite was quiet except for the whispers. Sarah wanted to unzip the tent and look outside, to see if there was some rational explanation for the sounds, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. The thought of opening that zipper, of exposing herself to whatever was out there, filled her with primal dread. The whispers continued for what felt like hours. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and Sarah drifted into an uneasy sleep. She dreamed of the wooden post. In her dream, she stood before it in darkness, and the carvings on its surface glowed with a faint blue light. She could read them now, though she didn't recognize the language. They told a story, she knew, but every time she thought she understood, the meaning slipped away like water through her fingers. Then the post began to change. The wood rippled like liquid, and faces emerged from its surface. Human faces, twisted in expressions of terror and anguish. They tried to speak, their mouths moving silently, their eyes pleading with her to understand. Sarah tried to back away, but found she couldn't move. The faces pushed further out of the wood, becoming more distinct. She recognized some of them now, though she didn't know how. Campers who had come to Blackwood decades ago. People who had disappeared. One face pushed out further than the others, its features becoming clear. It was a young woman, probably in her 20s, with long dark hair and eyes wide with fear. She mouthed a single word over and over. Run. Sarah woke with a gasp. The tent was dark, but not completely. A faint grey light filtered through the fabric, suggesting dawn was near. Next to her, Emma was sleeping restlessly, muttering in her sleep. And then Sarah heard it. Footsteps. They were louder than the night before, more confident. They weren't circling the tent this time. They were approaching it directly, coming from the direction of the wooden post. The footsteps stopped right outside. Sarah held her breath. Every muscle in her body tensed. She waited for something to happen, for the tent to be torn open, or for a voice to call out. But there was only silence. Then she heard a sound that made her blood freeze. Someone was unzipping the tent. The zipper moved slowly, tooth by tooth, starting from the bottom. Sarah wanted to scream, wanted to wake Emma, wanted to do anything, but she was paralyzed with fear. She could only watch as the opening grew larger, revealing the grey pre-dawn darkness outside. The zipper reached the top and stopped. The tent flap hung open. Nothing came in. Sarah waited, barely breathing, for something to happen, for a hand to reach in, for a face to appear in the opening, but there was nothing. Just the open tent and the silence and the faint whispers that never quite went away. Finally, as the sky began to lighten toward dawn, Sarah heard the footsteps retreat. They moved away from the tent, back toward the center of the clearing, back toward the post. Sarah lay awake until the sun came up, staring at the open tent entrance. When Emma woke and saw it, she sat up quickly, confusion on her face. "Did you open this?" "No," Sarah said, her voice hoarse. "Something else did." Part 3. Daylight Investigations. Emma stared at the open tent flap, then at Sarah. "What do you mean? Something else did?" Sarah told her everything. The footsteps the first night, the whispers she'd been hearing, and the terrifying sound of the zipper opening in the pre-dawn darkness. As she spoke, Emma's face grew increasingly pale. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Emma asked. "Would you have believed me?" "I barely believed it myself." Sarah climbed out of her sleeping bag, suddenly desperate to be in the sunlight. "Come on, let's talk to Marcus and Jake." Outside, the morning was beautiful again. Sunshine filtered through the trees. Birds sang, and a light breeze carried the scent of pine. It was hard to reconcile this peaceful scene with the terror of the night before. Marcus and Jake were already up, making coffee by the fire pit. They looked as tired as Sarah felt, with dark circles under their eyes. "Rough night?" Marcus asked, as the women approached. "You could say that," Sarah replied. "Did you guys hear anything weird last night?" Marcus and Jake exchanged glances. "Defined weird," Jake said carefully. So they had heard something. Sarah felt a mix of relief and fear. At least she wasn't crazy. Whispering, Emma said. "Like voices in the woods. And footsteps. And something opened our tent," Sarah added. Marcus set down his coffee cup. "Okay, look, I didn't want to freak anyone out, but yeah, we heard some strange stuff too. Footsteps, voices, all of it. I thought I was dreaming at first, but then Jake woke me up and asked if I heard it too. It sounded like people were walking around the campsite all night," Jake said. "Multiple people, but every time I looked out of the tent, there was nobody there. They were all quiet for a moment, the implications sinking in. Finally, Marcus spoke up. There has to be a rational explanation. Maybe there are other campers nearby that we didn't notice, or locals who know about this place and like to mess with people. Like I said before, locals who can unzip a tent from the outside without making any other sound," Sarah asked. "Who walk around all night whispering but never say anything coherent." "I'm just saying we shouldn't jump to supernatural conclusions," Marcus said defensively. "There's always a logical explanation for these things." Then let's find it, Emma said decisively. Let's explore this place properly. Look for evidence of other people, recent campfires, anything that might explain what we're hearing. It was a good plan, and it made Sarah feel slightly better. Taking action was better than sitting around feeling scared. They split up, agreeing to search in pairs and meet back at camp in 2 hours. Sarah and Emma headed toward the ruined bathroom building. Up close, it was even more decrepit than it had appeared from a distance. The roof had caved in on one side, and the walls were covered in moss and creeping vines. A rusted door hung crookedly from one hinge. Should we go in? Emma asked doubtfully. We've come this far, Sarah said, trying to sound braver than she felt. Inside, the building was a disaster. The floor was littered with leaves and debris, and holes in the roof let in shafts of light that illuminated floating dust motes. The remains of old sinks clung to one wall, their pipes corroded and hanging loose. Graffiti covered every available surface, most of it faded and illegible, decades old. But one piece of graffiti was newer, and it made Sarah stop in her tracks. Someone had spray-painted in bright red letters across the back wall, "They whisper at night." Below it, in a different hand and a different color, someone had added, "Don't listen." Well, that's comforting, Emma said weakly. Sarah pulled out her phone and took pictures, even though she couldn't send them anywhere. At least she'd have documentation when they got back to civilization. They searched the rest of the building but found nothing else of interest. Outside, they walked the perimeter of the campground, looking for any signs of recent human activity. They found old beer cans and cigarette butts, but they were all rusted or disintegrated, clearly years old. At the far edge of the clearing, Sarah noticed something odd. The trees at that point grew in an almost perfect line, as if they'd been deliberately planted to mark a boundary. And beyond that line, the forest looked different, darker. The trees were more closely spaced, their branches hanging lower. "Don't go past the trees," Emma said suddenly. Sarah looked at her friend. "What?" "I don't know why I said that," Emma admitted, looking confused. "It just felt important, like something bad would happen if we went into that part of the forest." Sarah felt the same instinct. The forest beyond that line of trees felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. Like stepping across would take you somewhere else, somewhere you weren't meant to be. They headed back toward camp, both of them unnerved. Marcus and Jake returned a few minutes later, looking equally troubled. "Find anything?" Sarah asked. "Nothing that makes sense," Jake said. He held up a small object. "We found this near that wooden post. It was a bracelet, the kind teenagers make with colorful beads and elastic string. The beads spelled out a name, Jennifer. It's not that old," Marcus said. "Maybe a year or two at most. The colors are still bright, and the elastic hasn't degraded much. So someone else has been here recently," Emma said. "That's good, right? It means there's a normal explanation for everything." But Sarah wasn't so sure. Something about the bracelet felt wrong. She couldn't say why, but looking at it made her uneasy. "Did you notice anything else?" he asked. Marcus nodded slowly. "The ground around that post. It's weird. Nothing grows there, not even weeds. And the soil is different. It's darker, almost black. There's something else," Jake added, his voice low. "We found tracks, bare footprints, just like in that story I told last night. They circle the post about a dozen times, then lead off toward the trees and just ... stop." The four of them looked at each other, the fear they'd been trying to suppress bubbling to the surface. "Maybe we should leave," Sarah said. "Pack up and head home. We can say we came, we camped, we had fun. No one needs to know we got spooked." "We can't leave yet," Marcus said. "It's already afternoon, and it'll take at least 3 hours to get back to the main road. By the time we pack everything up, it'll be getting dark. I don't want to be driving that mountain road in the dark." He was right, Sarah knew. The narrow, rutted track they'd driven in on was treacherous enough in daylight. Trying to navigate it after sunset would be asking for trouble. "So we stay one more night," Emma said, "but we stay together, all four of us in one tent, and we take shifts keeping watch." It was the best plan they could come up with. They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing, gathering extra firewood, and organizing their campsite. Marcus even drove the jeep closer to the tents, positioning it so the headlights could illuminate the area if needed. As the sun began to set, they made dinner quickly and ate in near silence. The cheerful camaraderie of the previous nights was gone, replaced by a tension they could all feel. They kept glancing toward the tree line, toward the wooden post, toward the deepening shadows. "Tell me more about your uncle," Sarah said to Marcus. "Did he really say this place was unlucky?" Marcus poked at the fire with a stick. He didn't like to talk about it much, but one time, when he'd had a few beers, he told me that something happened here back in the 30s. A group of campers disappeared, just vanished without a trace. The authorities searched for weeks, but never found any sign of them. The plaque, Sarah said. On the post, it's dated 1932. It says, "In memory of those lost." Jesus, Jake muttered. You think those people died here, or disappeared here? Emma said. Maybe that's why the campground was closed. Bad publicity. But that doesn't explain what's happening now, Sarah pointed out. Those disappearances were almost 100 years ago. What's making the sounds we've been hearing? What opened our tent? No one had an answer. As darkness fell, they huddled closer to the fire, feeding it constantly to keep the flames high. The whispers began again, right on schedule. Now that they all acknowledged hearing them, it was impossible to ignore. The sounds came from every direction, sometimes seeming close enough to be right next to them, sometimes distant and echoing. I can almost make out words, Jake said, his head tilted as he listened. Don't try, Emma said quickly. Remember the graffiti. Don't listen. Why not? Jake asked. Maybe if we understood what they're saying, we could figure out what's going on. But Sarah agreed with Emma. Some instinct told her that trying to understand the whispers would be a mistake. Like the feeling she'd had about crossing into that darker part of the forest, listening too closely felt dangerous. As the night deepened, they all moved into Marcus and Jake's tent. It was cramped with 4 people and their sleeping bags, but no one complained. Marcus took the first watch, sitting by the tent entrance with a flashlight while the others tried to sleep. Sarah lay in her sleeping bag, staring at the tent ceiling, listening to the sounds outside. The whispers were louder tonight, more insistent, and beneath them, she could hear the footsteps again. Multiple sets of them, walking in circles around the campsite, around the post, around the tents. A slow, steady rhythm like a ritual procession. Marcus suddenly tensed. Do you guys see that? He whispered.